They never tell you how heavy your own breath sounds when your life depends on keeping it completely inside your lungs, because the moment the digital clock on my nightstand flipped its glowing blue digits to exactly 3:14 a.m., the ambient hum of the refrigerator downstairs died, plunging the entire house into an absolute, suffocating silence that made the blood rushing through my ears sound like a crashing tide. My hand was frozen midair, inches away from the glass of water I had reached for, because the instruction manual left by the previous tenant wasn't a joke, and rule number 4 was now explicitly coming alive right outside my bedroom door. I could see the narrow slit of light from the hallway floor begin to warp, a dense, ink-like darkness bleeding under the frame, defying the law of physics as it pulled upward, stretching into a towering silhouette that pressed flush against the wood. My chest tightened automatically, a primal instinct screaming at me to draw in air, but the words scribbled in frantic red ink on the back of the pantry door flashed behind my eyes. Do not breathe when the shadow passes your door, because it doesn't look for movement, it listens for the expansion of your lungs. The wood of the door didn't creak, but it groaned under an impossible, weightless pressure, the fiber of the oak complaining as if something incredibly dense yet entirely ethereal was leaning its full, terrible mass against it. I forced my jaw shut, biting down on the inside of my cheek until the metallic tang of blood flooded my tongue, using the sharp sting of pain to override the desperate, burning reflex of my diaphragm demanding oxygen. Through the frosted glass panel at the top of the door, the silhouette wasn't just standing there, it was shifting, expanding sideways like spilled oil, long, spindly appendages that didn't resemble human arms scraping silently against the paint. The sound was microscopic, like a dry autumn leaf dragging across concrete, yet in the vacuum of my bedroom, it sounded like a chainsaw tearing through my sanity. My vision began to blur at the edges, tiny pinpricks of static light dancing across the darkness of the room as 40 seconds passed without air, my heart hammering so violently against my ribs that I was terrified the entity outside would hear the rhythmic thumping through the drywall. Every second stretched into a painful eternity as the shadow began its agonizingly slow crawl across the length of the doorframe, moving with a fluid, sickening grace that felt entirely alien to this world. I watched the darkness swallow the sliver of hallway light inch by inch, knowing that if I let out even a microscopic gasp, if a single molecule of air slipped past my lips, the door wouldn't just open, it would cease to exist, and whatever occupied that shadow would claim its place inside my room. My lungs felt like they were being filled with molten lead, the internal pressure building to an agonizing crescendo that made my limbs tremble uncontrollably, causing the bed frame beneath me to give a tiny, almost imperceptible metallic click. The shadow froze instantly, its mass condensing into a sharp, jagged point right where the doorknob sat, as if it were tilting its head, tuning its horrific, unseen senses to the exact origin of that microscopic sound. I clamped both hands over my mouth and nose, squeezing so tightly my fingernails dug into my skin, forcing my body into absolute, statuesque rigidity while my mind screamed for release. The silhouette outside began to press closer, the outline of what looked like a distorted, elongated face pressing against the frosted glass, flattening itself so hard against the pane that the glass began to spiderweb with tiny, silent fractures. It was studying the room, feeling for the vibration of life, searching for the one thing that separates the living from the dead. The rhythmic rise and fall of a human chest. My ribs were agonizingly tight, the lack of oxygen sending frantic panic signals to my brain, telling me that I was dying, that I was going to pass out right here on the mattress, and the moment unconsciousness took me, my body would betray me with a deep, reflexive inhale. Just as the darkness at the edge of my vision began to close in completely, threatening to pull me into a dead faint, The shadow suddenly shifted, its mass elongating as it began to drift away from the glass, sliding further down the hallway toward the spare room. The heavy, pressurized atmosphere in my bedroom lifted slightly, the air turning from icy cold back to the stagnant warmth of a midsummer night, though I still didn't dare to breathe, waiting until the faint glow of the hallway light fully reclaimed the space beneath my door. When I finally allowed my mouth to open, I didn't gasp. I let the carbon dioxide slip out in a slow, agonizingly controlled hiss, a ghost of a breath that took nearly 30 seconds to fully empty from my aching chest before I dared to take in a shallow, trembling sip of fresh air. But as my heart rate slowly began to stabilize and the static cleared from my eyes, my gaze drifted to the floor at the foot of my bed, where the shadow of my heavy wardrobe was cast by the pale moonlight filtering through the window. The wardrobe's shadow wasn't straight anymore, it was bent at a sickening angle, stretching toward the edge of my blankets, and as I watched in absolute, paralyzed horror, the darkness beneath my bed began to rise, mimicking the exact shape of the entity that had just passed the door. I realized then, with a cold dread that froze the newly acquired air inside my throat, that the rule hadn't just applied to the hallway, and that whatever was hunting me didn't need to open the door to get inside. The realization that the entity could manipulate any shadow within the room turned my blood to absolute ice, forcing me to lock my joints back into a state of rigid immobility before my lungs could even complete their second shallow cycle of air. The silhouette rising from beneath the bed didn't possess distinct eyes or a mouth, but it had a presence, a palpable aura of ancient, predatory malice that radiated a freezing cold so intense I could see the faint, misty puff of my own breath begin to form in the moonlight. That tiny plume of condensation was a death sentence. It was a physical manifestation of the air I desperately needed, a visual beacon that the shadow began to tilt toward, its form stretching like pulled taffy as it reached out a long, multi-jointed arm made of pure, shifting darkness toward the floating vapor. I clamped my teeth together so hard I felt a molar chip, trapping the next breath inside my throat while my eyes tracked the agonizingly slow advance of that midnight black hand as it hovered mere inches from my face. The entity was completely silent, yet my mind was suddenly flooded with a chaotic, overlapping cacophony of whispers that weren't my own, a chorus of desperate, suffocating voices all begging for a single breath, the collective echoes of those who had failed the rule in this house before me. The whispers grew louder, vibrating inside the bones of my skull, trying to trick my brain into panicking, trying to force a gasp of terror from my lips by simulating the feeling of drowning in deep, black water. My chest was a furnace of agony, the carbon dioxide building up to toxic levels, causing my muscles to twitch with violent, involuntary spasms that I had to fight with every ounce of my remaining willpower to suppress. The shadow hand open-palmed over my mouth, not touching my skin but hovering close enough that the air just above my lips felt like it was being sucked into a vacuum, a freezing void that wanted to violently pull the breath straight out of my lungs. I knew that if I lost consciousness now, the involuntary inhalation would be massive, a loud, ragged gasp that would give the entity exactly what it wanted, allowing it to pour its fluid, dark mass down my throat and hollow me out from the inside just like the voices in my head. My eyes searched the dark room for any kind of reprieve, any light source that could destroy the shadow, but the remote for the smart lights was across the room on the desk, a distance that might as well have been miles given my current paralysis. The only thing within reach was the heavy glass of water on my nightstand, its surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight, reflecting a distorted, miniature version of the horror unfolding above my bed. With the last fading embers of my strength, keeping my torso completely still and my breath locked away in the tightest vault of my ribs, I slid my right hand across the nightstand, my fingertips brushing against the cool, sweating glass. The shadow noticed the movement, its form twisting violently toward my arm, its main mass bloating as if preparing to strike, but before it could envelop my limb, I tipped the glass over. The water cascaded over the edge of the nightstand, splashing loudly onto the hardwood floor and soaking into the power strip beneath the bed, causing a sudden, violent eruption of bright blue electrical sparks to explode in the darkness. The brilliant, blinding flash of the short circuit illuminated every corner of the room for a fraction of a second, casting harsh, chaotic light that instantly shattered the entity's form, tearing its darkness into 1,000 scattered fragments that vanished into the walls with a sound like a distant, agonizing scream. The oppressive pressure in the room vanished instantly, the suffocating weight lifted from my chest, and I fell back against the pillows, my mouth agape as I dragged in huge, desperate gulps of air, my throat burning and my chest heaving as the room returned to its normal, quiet state. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the erratic rhythm of my own breathing, knowing that the sun wouldn't rise for another 3 hours, and that the power strip was dead, leaving the room entirely at the mercy of the changing moonlight and whatever new shadows it chose to cast.